John thought he knew everything about his life after 60 years of marriage, but one confession from Martha changed everything. A hidden truth, a secret buried for decades. What happens next will leave you speechless. Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. John and Martha Wilson had spent 60 years together, their love and commitment admired by everyone who knew them. Their modest home, surrounded by a carefully tended garden, stood as a testament to their enduring bond. The evening sun cast a golden hue over the neighborhood as they sat at the dining table, the aroma of freshly brewed tea filling the air. Martha, though frail with age, still carried an elegance that had captivated John decades ago. He too bore the marks of time: graying hair, a slow gait, the slight stoop of his tall frame, but his eyes still sparkled when he looked at her. "Martha," John said, his voice rich with affection, "do you ever think about how far we've come? 60 years, and we're still here, side by side." Martha smiled, but there was something else in her expression, a flicker of unease, a shadow of something unspoken. "I think about it all the time, John. We've been blessed, haven't we?" "We sure have," he replied, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "Our kids, our grandkids, they've all turned out so well. And it's all because of you, Martha. You've been the heart of this family." Her smile faltered, and she withdrew her hand, folding it tightly with the other in her lap. John noticed the change immediately. Concern creased his brow. "Is something wrong?" he asked gently. Martha hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. She had carried a heavy secret for decades, a secret she had vowed never to reveal. But now, as her health declined and the years ahead grew fewer, she knew she couldn't take it to her grave. John deserved to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything they had built. John leaned forward, sensing the weight of her silence. "Martha, whatever it is, you can tell me. We've faced everything together. This won't be any different." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her chair. "It's about our past, about the time when you were away working in Detroit." John's mind raced back to those early years of their marriage. He had taken a long-term assignment in Detroit to provide for their growing family, leaving Martha behind in their small Mississippi town. It had been a tough decision, but they had both agreed it was necessary. "What about it?" he asked gently. Martha's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "While you were gone, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I was lonely, John, and I let myself fall into something I shouldn't have. I got involved with another man." The weight of her words pressed down on John like a heavy stone. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, the world suddenly unfamiliar. He sat in stunned silence, his hands tightening into fists on the table. "There's more," Martha continued, her tears now streaming freely. "I became pregnant." John's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears. "When I realized what I had done, I was terrified," she sobbed. "I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't let it destroy what we had." John felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. "Martha," he said, his voice shaken, "are you saying—" She nodded, her voice barely audible. "I had the baby, a boy. I gave him up for adoption." The silence that followed was deafening. John stared at her, his mind unable to fully process what she had just confessed. "You kept this from me for 60 years?" His voice was low, trembling with emotion. 60 years, Martha? Why now? Why are you telling me this now?" Martha's hands trembled as she reached for his. "Because I couldn't take it to my grave. You deserve to know the truth, and I need you to forgive me, John, even if it's the hardest thing I'll ever ask of you." John pushed his chair back abruptly, standing as if the room had suddenly become too small. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He turned away, pacing the room as he struggled to contain the storm raging inside him. He wanted to lash out, to yell, to demand why she had stolen this truth from him for all these years. But beneath the anger, beneath the heartbreak, was something even more unbearable, a hollow, aching sadness. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly, his back still turned to her. Not yet. Martha's quiet sobs filled the room, but he couldn't turn around. Not now. He needed air. He needed space. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and walked out the front door, leaving Martha sitting at the table, the weight of her confession still hanging in the air. John wandered the quiet streets, his mind replaying the last hour like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Had his entire life been built on a lie? Had the love they shared been tainted from the start? He thought of their wedding day, the years of struggle and triumph, the family they had built together. Had it all been real? The pain was unbearable. He found himself sitting on a bench in the park where they used to take their children when they were young. The memories were vivid, but now they felt distant, like echoes of a life that belonged to someone else. The stars began to dot the night sky, but John couldn't bring himself to go home. He wasn't ready to face Martha again. Not yet. The woman he had loved for 60 years had become a stranger in a single moment. But despite the betrayal, despite the heartbreak, a single thought gnawed at him, relentless and inescapable. Somewhere out there, he had a son, and he had no idea who he was. John returned home in the early hours of the morning, his body exhausted, but his mind still churning with the weight of Martha's confession. He had spent the entire night walking aimlessly, trying to make sense of everything, but the truth sat like a boulder on his chest, immovable and suffocating. As he stepped through the front door, the house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Martha was asleep in her chair, a blanket draped over her lap, her breathing slow and shallow. He stood there for a long time, staring at her, feeling an unfamiliar mix of emotions: love, anger, sorrow, and something else he couldn't yet name. When morning came, Martha woke to find John sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes shadowed with thoughts that had kept him awake. She hesitated before joining him, her frail hands trembling as she poured herself a cup of tea. The silence between them was heavy, neither knowing how to begin. Finally, John spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Tell me everything." Martha looked down at the table, nodding slowly. "His name, I never gave him one. The adoption agency named him, but I never knew what it was. The family that took him in, they were from Chicago. I was young, John, and I was scared. I thought it was the only way to protect you, to protect our family." John clenched his jaw, swallowing the bitterness that rose in his throat. "Protect me?" he echoed. "You didn't protect me, Martha. You stole something from me. You took my son away before I even had the chance to know he existed." Martha flinched at the sharpness in his voice, but didn't argue. She had no defense, no justification that could make it right. "I know," she whispered, "and I regret it every single day." John exhaled, rubbing his temples as he tried to process it all. He had another child out there, someone who had lived an entire life without knowing him. He had to find him. He didn't know why, didn't know what he would even say if he did, but the thought of leaving this truth buried was unbearable. "I need to find him," he said at last, his voice steadier now, filled with quiet determination. Martha nodded, though there was fear in her eyes. "John, please, be careful." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood, grabbed his coat, and left the house again. This time, he had a purpose. The search was far from easy. He started with the limited information Martha had given him, but it wasn't much to go on. He reached out to adoption agencies, but most records from that time were sealed. The courthouse offered little help, the bureaucracy stifling and slow. He spent hours in libraries, combing through public records, tracing old newspapers, hoping for even the smallest lead. Every dead end only fueled his determination. Days turned into weeks, and still he found nothing. It was as if the child had vanished into thin air. But John refused to give up. He reached out to an old friend from church, someone who had experience in ancestry research. Together, they scoured online databases, cross-referencing names and locations, piecing together fragments of a life that had been hidden from him. Then, finally, a breakthrough. An article from 1978 in the Chicago Tribune mentioned a young boy named Michael Reynolds who had won a science fair. The name was unfamiliar, but the details lined up. His age, his location, his adoption history. John's hands trembled as he traced the words on the faded newspaper print. This was him. This had to be him. With renewed urgency, he followed the lead. Michael Reynolds had grown up in Chicago, attended college, and was now an architect working for a prominent firm in the city. He was married with 2 children of his own. John stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had found his son. But now came the hardest part. What if Michael didn't want to meet him? What if he resented the past, the choices made for him before he could understand them? John knew he had no right to demand anything from this man, no place in his life after all these years. But he couldn't ignore it. He had to try. For the first time in weeks, he returned home feeling something other than despair. He placed the printouts on the kitchen table, waiting for Martha to wake up. When she did, she saw the papers and gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. "You found him," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. John nodded. "I did." She reached out, hesitating before tracing her fingers over the name on the page. "Michael." "I have to go to Chicago," John said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Martha looked up at him, searching his face for something. Hesitation, doubt, but found none. She nodded, understanding that there was nothing she could say to change his mind. "Be careful, John," she murmured. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I have to do this." The next morning, he packed a small bag, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was going to meet his son. John's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the streets of Chicago, the towering skyline looming ahead of him. The city felt foreign, bustling with a rhythm he had never quite known. He had spent his life in a quiet suburban town where faces were familiar and change was slow. But here, everything moved fast, and his heart pounded in his chest as he neared his destination. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but nothing could prepare him for what lay ahead. Would Michael even listen? Would he care? Would he turn him away? The questions gnawed at him, but he forced himself to keep driving. He parked outside the address he had found for Michael's workplace, an architectural firm in the heart of the city. Through the glass doors, he caught glimpses of employees moving about, engaged in conversations, their lives completely separate from his. And then he saw him. Michael Reynolds, his son. He was taller than John expected, with broad shoulders and a confident stride. He carried himself with the ease of a man who had built a life for himself, a man who belonged here. For a long moment, John simply watched from a distance, unsure if he had the courage to go inside. Instead, he waited. An hour passed before Michael finally stepped out of the building, dressed in a crisp suit, briefcase in hand. He walked with purpose, heading toward a nearby cafe. John's heart pounded as he followed, his footsteps heavy with hesitation. He had come all this way, but now, standing mere feet from his son, he felt paralyzed. He took a deep breath and approached. "Excuse me," John said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Do you mind if I join you for a moment?" Michael looked up from his coffee, surprised by the sudden intrusion. His expression was polite but guarded. Sure. Do I know you?" John sat down slowly, the weight of the decades pressing on his shoulders. He studied Michael's face, searching for traces of himself, of Martha. He saw them in the sharpness of his jawline, the way his brow furrowed in curiosity. "No, you don't," John admitted, "but I know you." Michael set his cup down, now visibly wary. "Okay." John took another breath, steadying himself. "My name is John Wilson. I came here because I know, that I'm your biological father." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Michael blinked, his expression frozen in place. Then he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "I'm sorry, what?" John leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. "I know, this is a lot to take in. I wouldn't have come if I wasn't sure. I have records, your birth certificate, adoption papers. Your mother, Martha, she told me everything." Michael's jaw tightened. "Martha? Who the hell is Martha?" John exhaled slowly. "Your biological mother. She gave you up for adoption when you were a baby. She thought she was protecting you, protecting our family. I didn't know about you until a few weeks ago." Michael pushed his chair back slightly, shaking his head. "This is insane. You can't just show up out of nowhere and drop something like this on me." "I know," John said quickly, "and I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to see you, to tell you the truth. You deserve to know." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "You think I deserve to know? After all these years? Where the hell were you when I was growing up? When I had questions about where I came from? When I was looking for something that made sense?" John felt the words cut deep, but he didn't flinch. He had expected this, had prepared for it. "I didn't know," he said honestly. "If I had, I would have looked for you sooner. But Martha, she never told me. I had no idea you existed." Michael stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he scoffed, shaking his head. "And now, after 60 years, you think we can just what? Catch up? Be a family?" John's throat tightened. "I don't know. I just know I couldn't let another day go by without trying." Michael leaned back, crossing his arms. "Why now? Why did she finally decide to tell you?" John hesitated before answering. "She's dying." Michael's face hardened. John continued, his voice softer now. "She didn't want to take the secret to her grave. She wanted me to know the truth, and I think, deep down, she wanted you to know it too." A long silence stretched between them. The noise of the cafe buzzed around them, but John barely heard it. Michael exhaled sharply and looked away. "This is too much. I need time." John nodded, his chest aching. "I understand." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. "This is my number. If you ever want to talk or ask questions, I'll be here." Michael hesitated before taking it, slipping it into his pocket without looking at it. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I have to go," he said, his voice distant. "I have a meeting." John stood as well, resisting the urge to say something more, to reach out, but he knew he couldn't push. "Thank you for listening," he said instead. "That's all I could ask for." Michael didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, leaving John standing alone at the table. As he watched his son disappear into the busy streets of Chicago, John felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him. He had found him, but had he lost him just as quickly? The only thing he could do now was wait. The days that followed were some of the longest of John's life. He tried to keep busy, tending to the garden, reading old newspapers, even attempting to lose himself in television, but nothing could distract him from the constant ache of waiting. Every time the phone rang, his heart would leap, only for it to be a telemarketer or one of his neighbors checking in. He told himself not to hope too much, not to expect anything, but deep down, the uncertainty was unbearable. Had he pushed too hard? Had he ruined any chance of knowing his son before it even began? Then, one evening, as he sat in his chair staring at the phone, it finally rang. This time, the voice on the other end was not a stranger. "John?" His breath caught in his throat. "Yes?" A pause, then Michael's voice, careful but firm. "I've been thinking about what you said. I have questions. A lot of them." Relief flooded John's chest, though he tried to keep his voice steady. "Of course. I'll answer anything you want to know. Can we meet again? Somewhere quieter this time," Michael said. John swallowed hard. "I'd like that, son. Very much." The air was cool and crisp as John waited on the park bench, clutching his coat tightly around him. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind the only sound aside from his own breathing. He had spent the past few days replaying every word of their conversation, second-guessing himself, wondering if he had said too much or too little. He knew this meeting was fragile, that one wrong word could shatter everything. Michael approached from across the park, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading sunlight. He carried himself with the same confidence as before, but there was hesitation in his steps, uncertainty in his eyes. John stood, nodding as Michael reached him. "Michael," he said carefully. "John," Michael replied, his tone even but softer than before. They sat down together, both staring ahead at the quiet scenery, as if the stillness of the park might give them the words they needed. The silence stretched between them until Michael finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you told me, about you, about Martha, about the fact that my entire life was never what I thought it was." John nodded, his throat tight. "I imagine it's a lot to process." Michael let out a breath. "It is. When you showed up at the cafe, I was angry. Not just at you, but at the idea that my whole life might have been built on a lie. Angela and Richard, they were my parents in every way that mattered. They gave me a good life, a loving home. But now I know there's this whole other part of my story that I never knew existed. I'm not here to take anything away from that," John said quietly. "I don't want to erase the life you had. I wanted to know you, even if it's just for a little while." Michael exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on the distance. "I have questions. About Martha, about you, about why she decided to give me up." "I'll answer anything you want to know," John said. For the next hour, they talked. John shared stories about his life with Martha, the struggles they had faced, the love they had built. He told Michael about the moment she had confessed, about the pain of knowing he had been robbed of decades with a son he never knew existed. He explained Martha's decision, not as a rejection, but as a desperate attempt to protect a life she thought would be destroyed by her mistake. Michael listened intently, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to understanding. He asked hard questions, and John answered them as honestly as he could. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive her," Michael admitted at last, "for keeping this from me, for letting me grow up without knowing where I came from." John nodded, his voice heavy. "I don't expect you to. She made a choice, one that hurt both of us, but she never stopped thinking about you, Michael. She never stopped loving you, even from a distance." Michael was quiet for a long time, his fingers tapping against his knee. Then, finally, he spoke. I think I want to meet her." John's heart swelled with relief. That would mean the world to her. A few days later, Michael arrived at John and Martha's home. John had prepared Martha for the meeting, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the moment she saw him standing in the doorway. She was frail, confined to her chair, but her eyes sparkled with anticipation. As Michael stepped inside, she reached out a trembling hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry for everything." Michael knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. His expression was unreadable, but his grip was firm. "You don't have to apologize, Martha," he said softly. "I understand now. You did what you thought was best." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, Thank you for giving me this moment." They spent the evening sharing stories, laughter, and tears. For the first time in decades, the weight of Martha's secret was lifted, replaced by the warmth of a new connection. Michael showed her pictures of his family, spoke about his children, his work, and she listened with pride as though making up for lost time. John watched from across the room, his heart full. The pain and turmoil of the past few weeks had been worth it, if only for this moment. To see his wife and son together, bridging a gap that had once seemed insurmountable. The weeks that followed were a gift. Michael visited regularly, bringing his wife and children to meet John and Martha. They shared meals, memories, and for the first time in a long time, the house was filled with life again. But time was not on their side. Martha's health continued to decline, and it became clear to everyone that her days were numbered. On a crisp autumn morning, surrounded by her family, she passed away peacefully, a contented smile on her face. In the days after the funeral, John found solace in the connections they had built. Michael had become a steady presence in his life, not just a long-lost son, but a part of his future. And though the pain of losing Martha was immense, John felt a sense of peace, knowing that her final wish had been fulfilled. One evening, as John sat on the porch with Michael, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd get this chance. To know you, to have you in my life. Your mother, she gave me that gift, and I'll be forever grateful." Michael placed a hand on John's shoulder, his expression warm. "I think we were both given a gift," he said, "and I'm glad we didn't miss it." As the stars began to dot the night sky, John felt a profound sense of closure. His journey had been filled with pain, love, and discovery, but it had led him to this moment, a reminder that even in life's most unexpected turns, there was always room for forgiveness, connection, and hope. Life is full of unexpected twists, and sometimes, even after decades, the truth finds its way to the surface. John and Michael's story proves that forgiveness and second chances are always possible. What do you think about this incredible journey? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with others.